Before we begin our journey into the story of the Titanic, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe grab a blanket and settle in. If you enjoy these quiet dives into history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep making these calming stories, and it means you'll never miss a voyage into the past. Now, let's step back in time to an age of ambition, pride, and the dream of a ship that could never sink. At the turn of the 20th century, the world was buzzing with confidence. Factories hummed, trains shrieked across the land, and telegraphs carried words faster than anyone in history thought possible. People honestly believed there was nothing mankind couldn't build. If you wanted a tower, you made it scrape the sky. If you wanted a bridge, you stretched it across rivers and valleys. And if you wanted a ship, well, you made the biggest one anyone had ever seen. This was the age of industrial ambition, and ocean liners were the ultimate bragging rights. The Atlantic Ocean was the battleground. Every wealthy traveller, immigrant and dreamer needed to cross it, and companies wanted their ticket money. Two giants dominated the scene, Cunard Line and White Star Line. Cunard boasted speed. They had sleek, fast ships like the Lusitania and the Mauretania. White Star, however, wanted something different. They weren't racing the clock. They were selling comfort, class and luxury that made a week at sea feel like a holiday in Paris. Enter J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of White Star Line. Ismay had ambition dripping from his moustache. He wanted his company to dominate, to crush Cunard not with speed but with elegance. Alongside him was Lord William Pirrie, the shipbuilding magnate from Harland and Wolff in Belfast. Pirrie's yards had the tools and the manpower to make impossible dreams real. Together, over late-night dinners and glasses of brandy, they dreamed up the plan, not one giant ship but three, the Olympic, the Titanic and the Britannic. These ships wouldn't just be vessels, they would be floating palaces. Imagine grand staircases dripping with gold trim, dining rooms fit for kings, Turkish baths and private promenades. Every detail was designed to whisper, "You've made it." For the wealthiest passengers, it wasn't enough to cross the sea, they wanted to do it in style. The Titanic promised a voyage that was as much about the journey as the destination. But Titanic's biggest boast wasn't its chandeliers or its dining rooms, it was its safety. 16 watertight compartments, steel doors that could close at the push of a button. Engineers claimed the ship could stay afloat even if 4 compartments flooded. Newspapers ran with it. Advertisements bragged about it. Titanic wasn't just a marvel of comfort, she was practically unsinkable. Those 2 words would echo across history. The world ate it up. People wanted to believe that humans had finally conquered the ocean. Crossing the Atlantic had always been dangerous. Storms, collisions, shipwrecks. But Titanic seemed to erase all that fear. Passengers weren't just buying a ticket, they were buying peace of mind. When you stepped aboard, you weren't just a traveller, you were part of the modern age, riding a machine that was supposedly indestructible. It's important to remember the mood of the early 1900s. Airplanes had just taken flight. Cities were lit up with electric bulbs. Medicine was advancing. Nations were racing to prove who could be the most modern, the most powerful. It was an era that believed in progress like a religion. If the Titanic had a soul, it was the spirit of human pride. It was mankind saying, "Look at what we can do." And that pride was contagious. Wealthy elites lined up for tickets. Middle-class travellers dreamed of sitting in Titanic's lounges. Immigrants in steerage saved everything they had to board her, believing the ship itself was a sign of destiny. For many, Titanic wasn't just transportation, it was a symbol, a giant gleaming promise of a brighter future across the Atlantic. But there was something else under the surface, something no one wanted to admit. The Titanic wasn't just a marvel, she was also a gamble. Every rivet, every compartment, every promise of safety came from human hands, and human hands, no matter how skilled, make mistakes. Yet in that spring of 1912, no one wanted to hear about doubt. Titanic wasn't built for doubt, she was built for faith. So the dream of the unsinkable ship was born. She was more than iron and rivets, she was confidence in physical form gliding toward her fate. The world looked up at Titanic and saw the future. And like so many dreams of the industrial age, that future seemed untouchable. Little did they know, this story wasn't heading toward triumph. It was heading toward the most famous shipwreck in history. When the Titanic was first dreamed up, the only way to make her real was to turn vision into steel. That job fell to Harland and Wolff, the legendary shipyard in Belfast. This wasn't just a place where boats were made. This was a factory of giants. The moment you stepped into the yard, you'd be swallowed by the sound of hammers on rivets, the hiss of steam, and the constant rumble of men at work. Building Titanic was like building a floating skyscraper, and it would take thousands of hands to bring her to life. Over 15,000 men laboured at Harland and Wolff. Most were ordinary dock workers, strong backs, calloused hands, and pockets often empty by payday. These weren't rich men sipping brandy. These were men climbing scaffolds, swinging hammers, and hauling steel plates the size of train cars. Work was brutal. Accidents were common. The yard even had its own hospital, and sadly, it stayed busy. But there was pride too. The men knew they were building something the world had never seen. Titanic wasn't alone. She was one of 3 planned giants, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. The Olympic came first, and in many ways Titanic was her twin. But Titanic would be just a little bit bigger, a little bit fancier. White Star wanted her to be the crown jewel, the one everyone remembered. Rivalries weren't just between companies anymore. They were between sisters. The numbers were staggering. Titanic would stretch nearly 900 feet long and weigh more than 46,000 tons. To put it in perspective, she was longer than the tallest skyscraper of her time laid on its side. Her anchors were so heavy it took 20 horses just to pull one through these streets of Belfast. Everything about her was oversized, as if the builders wanted to shout, "Look what we can do!" Riveting the ship was a job all its own. Teams of 4 or 5 men worked together like a machine. One heated the rivet until it glowed red, another tossed it up with tongs, and 2 men hammered it into place with sledgehammers the size of tree branches. The sound echoed through the yard day and night. Clang, 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 a rhythm of progress. Some said you could hear the shipyard from miles away. Of course, not everyone was so starry-eyed. Building something this massive came with risks. Workers were crushed by falling beams, burned by steam, or drowned in the docks. By the time Titanic was launched, at least 8 men had lost their lives on her construction. Their names never made the headlines, but without them, Titanic would never have existed. But tragedy didn't stop the work. The men kept at it, driven by wages and by pride. Titanic slowly rose from the slipway like a steel mountain. From the ground, her hull was so tall you had to crane your neck to see the top. She looked less like a ship and more like a building, as if someone had laid a skyscraper on its side and pushed it toward the sea. Inside, craftsmen worked on the luxury details. Carpenters carved wood panels, artists sketched designs for stained glass, and upholsterers prepared velvet chairs. The ship was a contradiction. Half gritty labour, half refined artistry. Outside, men hammered steel in clouds of smoke. Inside, others built a palace that would someday host the richest of the rich. By 1911, the Titanic was ready for her big reveal. Thousands crowded the Belfast docks to watch her launch. Workers, families, and curious townsfolk gathered to see the giant slide into the water. No champagne bottle was smashed on her bow. This wasn't superstition, this was business. Still, when she touched the sea for the first time, cheers erupted. The giant was alive. The Titanic floated, but she was far from finished. Her engines had to be installed, her interiors polished, her kitchen stocked. But in that moment, watching her glide into the river Lagan, people believed they were witnessing history, and they were. Though no one in that crowd knew it, they weren't just building a ship, they were building a legend. When people heard about the Titanic, they didn't just imagine steel and rivets. They imagined velvet chairs, polished wood, and champagne on ice. White Star Line wanted passengers to feel like they were stepping into a floating palace. Forget cramped cabins and damp decks. This was elegance at sea. If you had money, the Titanic was less of a ship and more of a vacation home with engines. At the heart of this dream was the grand staircase. It wasn't just a way to get from one floor to another. It was a stage. Sweeping oak railings, carved cherubs, and a glass dome above that let the sunlight pour down. If you were rich enough to walk those steps, you weren't just travelling. You were announcing your place in the world, one polished step at a time. Dining was its own kind of theatre. The first-class dining saloon could seat over 500 people with white linen, silver cutlery, and menus longer than most people's grocery lists. Guests dined on oysters, lamb with mint sauce, and fancy French desserts. For some passengers, the meals were worth the ticket price alone. Crossing the Atlantic had never tasted so good, and it wasn't just eating. Titanic had a Parisian-style cafe for coffee and pastries, a smoking room for gentlemen with cigars and brandy, and even a Turkish bath where you could sweat out your troubles before returning to the card tables. This wasn't a ship, it was a floating resort. If you closed your eyes, you could almost forget you were in the middle of the Atlantic. But don't think the second-class passengers were slumming it. They had their own dining rooms, libraries, and smoking lounges. In fact, the second-class amenities on Titanic were better than what many first-class passengers got on other ships. For middle-class professionals and families, it was like sneaking into a life they couldn't usually afford. Then there was third class, steerage. It didn't have chandeliers or velvet cushions, but compared to other ships, it was surprisingly decent. Families shared simple but clean cabins, meals were hearty, and there were even shared spaces for music and dancing. For many immigrants heading to America, it was the nicest place they'd ever stayed. The contrast was staggering. In one part of the ship, millionaires sipped fine wines under golden light. In another, families huddled together in small bunks, clutching tickets that had cost their life savings. Yet somehow, all were bound together by the same steel hull. Titanic was like a miniature world, luxury on top, struggle below, and water pressing at the edges. For the wealthy elite, Titanic was more than a ship. It was a stage to see and be seen. You didn't just walk the promenade deck for fresh air. You did it to show off your new hat, your tailored suit, your place in society. The ship wasn't just about comfort. It was about status. Every step was a statement. Even the crew got caught up in the glamour. Stewards polished silver until it gleamed. Chefs fussed over meals, and band members practiced waltzes and ragtime. They weren't just doing their jobs, they were part of the performance. Titanic wasn't just about getting people across the sea. It was about convincing them they were part of something grand. And so, as Titanic prepared for her maiden voyage, she gleamed like no ship before her. From the grand staircase to the humblest bunk, every detail had been planned. For some, she was a palace. For others, a promise. But for all, she was unforgettable. This wasn't just luxury at sea, it was the illusion of perfection. A ship as grand as the Titanic needed more than polished brass and velvet curtains. It needed people to bring it alive. Before the maiden voyage, White Star Line carefully chose a crew of nearly 900 men and women. From the captain to the coal shovelers, every role mattered. This wasn't just a ship, it was a floating city, and cities need workers. At the top stood Captain Edward John Smith. With his white beard and calm eyes, he was known as the millionaire's captain, trusted by the rich and famous. This was meant to be his final voyage before retirement, a graceful ending to a long career. Little did anyone know it would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Beneath him was a team of officers, each with a sharp uniform and sharper nerves. First Officer William Murdoch, Chief Officer Henry Wilde, and others made sure order was kept from bow to stern. They were the ones who gave orders to sailors, kept eyes on the horizon, and made sure the grand show stayed on schedule. Then there were the stokers and firemen, men who lived in the bowels of the ship. Their world wasn't chandeliers and champagne, it was roaring furnaces, sweat, and coal dust. They worked around the clock to keep Titanic's 29 boilers roaring, shoveling coal into fireboxes that burned like the gates of hell. Without them, Titanic wouldn't move an inch. And then came the stewards and stewardesses, the smiling faces of the ship. They carried luggage, poured drinks, delivered meals, and answered bells at all hours. For them, Titanic wasn't luxury. It was hard labour dressed in polite smiles. But to passengers, they were the friendly link between dream and reality. But what about the passengers themselves? Oh, what a cast of characters boarded Titanic. There were millionaires like John Jacob Astor, travelling with his young bride. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, who packed a wardrobe that could rival a department store. And then there was the unsinkable Molly Brown, who wasn't about to let anyone push her around. In second class, there were teachers, clergymen, and professionals. These were the middle-class folks enjoying a taste of high society. They weren't dining with the Astors, but they weren't in the coal bunkers either. For many, Titanic was the finest experience of their lives, a week of living just a little above their usual means. And then there were the third-class passengers, also called steerage. Whole families from Ireland, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe climbed aboard, chasing dreams of America. They carried bundles, blankets, and hopes for a new life. The Titanic was their gateway to opportunity, one they'd scraped together every last penny to afford. Altogether, Titanic carried more than 2,200 souls: crew, millionaires, middle-class professionals, and immigrants with empty pockets. For a few days, they would all share the same ship, though their worlds were divided by decks and doors. It was a strange floating society, one that mirrored life on land but compressed into steel walls. As Titanic prepared to cast off, excitement buzzed through every corridor. For the rich, it was a chance to show off. For the poor, it was a chance to start fresh. And for the crew, it was another day's work, though one that would go down in history. The stage was set, the actors were aboard, and the curtain was about to rise on the most famous voyage ever. On the morning of April 10th, 1912, the port of Southampton was buzzing like a festival. Crowds gathered on the docks, waving handkerchiefs, shouting goodbyes and craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the world's newest wonder. The Titanic, with her 4 massive funnels and gleaming hull, towered over the harbour like a steel castle. For most people, this was the biggest thing they'd ever seen in their lives. Passengers streamed aboard. Wealthy ladies in feathered hats and long gowns climbed the gangways with their maids trailing behind. Men in top hats barked orders at porters who struggled with mountains of trunks. Meanwhile, families in steerage clutched worn suitcases, holding tightly to children who stared wide-eyed at the giant ship. It was a parade of the world's classes, all funneling into one steel vessel. Inside, crew members scrambled to settle passengers into their cabins. Stewards guided first-class guests to their suites, offering polite bows and smiles. Down below, third-class travellers found their bunks, smaller but cleaner than most had expected. Everyone carried a different story, but at that moment they all shared the same destination, New York. At noon, the great moment came. Titanic's ropes were cast off, and tugboats pulled her from the dock. Steam billowed from her funnels as whistles echoed across the port. The crowd erupted in cheers, hats waved in the air, and a band on shore played lively tunes. It wasn't just a ship leaving port, it was history setting sail. But excitement nearly turned into disaster right away. As Titanic glided past, her massive size created a suction in the harbour. Nearby, the small steamer SS New York broke loose from her moorings and drifted dangerously close. For a moment, it looked like Titanic might collide on her very first day at sea. Thankfully, tugboats rushed in and pulled the SS New York back, avoiding a crash by only a few feet. Onlookers gasped, some even taking it as a bad omen. But the Titanic sailed on, her passengers mostly unaware of how close they'd come to embarrassment or worse. It was a shaky start for a ship that claimed to be unsinkable. Once clear of danger, Titanic pushed ahead into the English Channel. On deck, passengers leaned against the railings, watching the green countryside fade into the horizon. For some, it was a routine journey. For others, it was the last glimpse of home they'd ever see. Excitement mingled with sadness as the ship pressed toward the open sea. In first class, champagne corks popped as passengers toasted the voyage. Musicians played waltzes in the lounges, and servants hurried about carrying silver trays. Down in steerage, families unpacked bread and cheese from home, sharing simple meals on wooden benches. Titanic was already showing 2 very different versions of the same journey. The weather was crisp but calm, and Titanic's engines purred steadily as she moved away from land. Children played on deck, couples strolled arm in arm, and sailors kept watch as the ship cut through the waves. The mood was light, the great adventure had begun, and nothing seemed capable of spoiling it. As the sun set, Titanic's lights flickered on, glowing like a floating city in the twilight. Passengers dined, laughed, and settled into cabins as the ship sailed toward her next stops in France and Ireland. No one on board could have imagined what awaited them. For now, the Titanic was a dream at sea, her voyage just beginning. After leaving Southampton, Titanic glided smoothly through the English Channel, heading for her first stop in France. The ship's passengers gathered along the rails, staring out at the white cliffs of the coast as they faded into the distance. For many, this was their last look at England, and the moment carried both excitement and a little sadness. By evening, the ship arrived at Cherbourg, France. The harbour was too shallow for Titanic's massive hull to dock, so smaller tender boats ferried passengers and luggage to and from the ship. The wealthy stepped aboard in fur coats and pearls, greeted by stewards as if entering a grand hotel. For them, the voyage was just beginning. At Cherbourg, some of Titanic's most famous passengers joined the voyage. Among them was John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, travelling with his young bride. There was also Molly Brown, who would later earn the nickname Unsinkable. The ship was quickly filling with a cast of characters that history would never forget. While the rich boarded in style, Second and third class passengers climbed into the tenders with little fanfare. Families clutched suitcases and blankets. Children sat quietly on benches and seagulls wheeled overhead. For them, this wasn't about luxury, it was about opportunity. The Titanic was their bridge to a new life across the Atlantic. Once everyone was aboard, Titanic pulled away from France and turned toward Ireland. The sea stretched dark and calm as the ship powered westward. On deck, passengers wrapped themselves in coats against the chill, gazing up at the funnels that belched smoke into the starry night. The sense of adventure was thick in the air. By the next day, Titanic arrived at Queenstown, Ireland, today known as Cobb. Once again, tender boats were used to bring passengers aboard. This stop was especially emotional. Dozens of Irish emigrants climbed on with heavy hearts, leaving behind families they might never see again. For many, this was the beginning of their American dream. In Queenstown, third-class passengers made up most of the new arrivals. They were farmers, laborers, and families looking for work in America. The air buzzed with nervous energy, hope mixed with sorrow. Parents whispered promises to children about the better life waiting across the sea. Meanwhile, first-class passengers watched the scene from the upper decks. For them, the boarding of steerage families was a distant curiosity, viewed from far above. Titanic was a ship of contrasts, wealth and poverty sharing the same steel walls, yet separated by glass doors and decks. By the afternoon, the last tender had pulled away, and Titanic set her course west into the Atlantic. Over 2,200 souls were now aboard. Onshore, families waved tearful farewells as the great ship slipped into the horizon. For those left behind, it was the last glimpse they would ever have of their loved ones. With England, France, and Ireland behind her, Titanic was finally on the open ocean. The passengers settled into their cabins, the engines roared steadily, and the Atlantic stretched endlessly ahead. The ship was now fully committed to her journey, a floating city bound for New York, carrying dreams, pride, and fate on her decks. Once Titanic left the Irish coast behind, life at sea truly began. The Atlantic stretched out in every direction, a rolling blue carpet that seemed endless. On deck, passengers leaned into the cool breeze, some wide-eyed with wonder, others already settled into routine. The great ship became its own little world, floating on the waves. In first class, mornings began with breakfast served on fine china, kedgeree, toast, eggs and tea. Afterwards, passengers strolled the promenade deck, women in wide hats with ribbons fluttering in the wind, men puffing cigars and discussing business. The ship wasn't just transportation, it was a stage where wealth and elegance performed their daily act. Second-class life was more modest, but still comfortable. Families gathered in the library or played deck games. School teachers, clergy and professionals mingled, enjoying a taste of high society they might never see again. Titanic's second class was better than many other ships' first class, a fact passengers boasted about with pride. Down in third class, life was simpler but lively. Meals of stew, bread and tea were served in bright communal rooms. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing and swapping stories in Irish, Scandinavian and Eastern European tongues. At night, fiddles came out and dances filled the air. For many, this was the best treatment they had ever received on a ship. The ship's band played daily, drifting between lounges and dining rooms. Their music was a mix of waltzes, ragtime and light classical pieces, a soundtrack for elegance. Whether you were sipping champagne in first class or enjoying coffee in second, chances are you heard the soft strains of a violin nearby. Children had their own adventures. They ran along the decks, played shuffleboard and chased each other between deck chairs. Some stared wide-eyed at the ocean, marveling at how the waves never seemed to end. For the youngest, Titanic was less a ship and more a playground with no fences. Below the surface, life was very different. In the boiler room, stokers shoveled coal into furnaces, stripped to the waist and dripping with sweat. The roar of fire and clang of machinery drowned out all else. Their world was hot, loud and brutal, but without them, Titanic's luxury would grind to a halt. Mealtimes brought everyone together, though together looked very different depending on where you sat. First-class guests dined on oysters and roast duck paired with French wines. In second class, stews and puddings filled the tables. Third class had simpler fare, but hot food was served daily, a luxury for many immigrants. Evenings sparkled with activity. In first class, the lounges filled with card games, laughter and gossip. Second-class passengers read novels or joined sing-alongs. In third class, the sound of fiddles and stomping feet turned the lower decks into a festival. For a few nights, the Titanic was less a ship and more a floating carnival. As night fell, the ship glowed with electric lights, a city at sea. Passengers drifted to their cabins, rocked gently by the calm Atlantic swells. On the horizon, nothing but stars. Life at sea on Titanic felt safe, almost magical, as though the ship truly was untouchable. By April 12th and 13th, Titanic was deep into the Atlantic. The sea seemed endless and calm, almost too calm. Passengers strolled, laughed, and enjoyed the crisp air. But in the wireless room, messages began piling up. Reports from other ships warning of dangerous icebergs drifting in Titanic's path. The warnings came from ships like the Coronia, the Baltic, and the Californian. Each reported fields of ice, some stretching for miles. The North Atlantic in spring was notorious for icebergs drifting south from Greenland. They were jagged, white, and silent, mountains floating in the dark sea. Captain Edward Smith received the warnings and made notes, but Titanic kept her course. After all, this was routine. Ships crossed these waters every year, and Titanic was thought to be unsinkable. Why slow down when the sea looked so calm? The passengers certainly weren't worried. They were too busy enjoying the sunshine. On deck, first-class passengers lounged in wicker chairs, wrapped in blankets as stewards served tea. Second-class passengers walked the promenade, enjoying the sea air. Down in steerage, children played tag while parents swapped stories. No one could imagine danger lurking just beyond the horizon. In the Marconi wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked tirelessly. They weren't just handling ice warnings, they were buried under personal messages from passengers eager to send telegrams home. The crackle of the wireless filled the air as they tried to keep up. One warning from the America reported icebergs directly in Titanic's path. Another from the Californian described an entire field of ice ahead. But the wireless operators, overwhelmed, sometimes treated the warnings as just another message to pass along later. Technology was still new, and human error was always lurking. Meanwhile, Titanic sped ahead at over 22 knots. The engines roared steadily, pushing the giant through waters where other captains might have slowed. But Titanic had a reputation to keep. She was the fastest luxury liner on her route, and no one wanted to disappoint the wealthy guests by arriving late. On Sunday, April 14th, the weather turned eerily calm. The ocean lay like glass with no waves to break against the hull. Sailors knew this was dangerous. It made spotting icebergs harder. No waves meant no white foam crashing at their bases. Ice could be invisible until it was too late. That night the temperature dropped sharply. Breath turned to mist, and sailors buttoned coats tighter as the air grew icy cold. The stars glittered above, bright and endless. It was a beautiful night, almost magical. But the cold was a warning. The sea was telling them ice was near. By evening, at least 7 iceberg warnings had been received. They were written down, acknowledged, and filed away. The ship pressed on, lights glowing, music playing, passengers laughing. Titanic sailed boldly into the night, unaware that danger drifted silently in the darkness ahead. Sunday, April 14th, 1912 began like any other day at sea. The sun shone bright, the air was cool, and passengers relaxed in the calm weather. Children played games on deck, women strolled with parasols, and men leaned against the rails with cigars. No one could have guessed that by nightfall, history would take a chilling turn. Some sang with devotion, while others simply enjoyed the chance to socialize. It was a peaceful moment, and many left the service feeling calm, even blessed, without knowing it would be their last Sunday. As the day wore on, the temperature dropped sharply. The sea turned glassy, eerily smooth, like black marble. Sailors on watch muttered uneasily. This kind of stillness was dangerous. With no waves breaking at their bases, icebergs would be nearly invisible. The night promised to be beautiful, but it also promised to be risky. By evening, first-class passengers gathered in the lavish dining saloon for a grand Sunday dinner. Multi-course meals, fine wines, and lively conversation filled the room. John Jacob Astor entertained guests. Molly Brown cracked witty jokes, and laughter echoed through the halls. No one suspected they were enjoying their final feast aboard the ship. After dinner, the lounges came alive. Some passengers played cards, others smoked cigars, and a few strolled the promenade under the stars. The ship's band played waltzes and ragtime, filling the air with music. It was a night of elegance, laughter, and calm seas, the kind of evening that lulled everyone into a false sense of security. Meanwhile, in third class, passengers made their own fun. Fiddles and accordions filled the air as families danced, sang, and clapped to lively tunes. Children dozed in their parents' laps as music kept spirits high. Down below, the mood was simple, joyful, and free from the worries of the wealthy. On the bridge, the officers kept watch. The sky was so clear it felt like every star in the universe had come out to shine. The moon, however, was absent, leaving the night darker than usual. The lookouts in the crow's nest peered into the blackness, eyes straining for any sign of danger. Passengers who stepped onto the deck that night were stunned. The sea stretched flat and endless, not a ripple in sight. Breath turned to mist in the freezing air, and the silence was so complete it felt otherworldly. Some said it was the most beautiful night they had ever seen. Others admitted later that it felt almost too calm, like the ocean was holding its breath. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked frantically, sending and receiving messages. The machines crackled with telegrams, not just from ships warning of ice, but from wealthy passengers eager to send notes home. The warnings were piling up, but so were the dinner invitations and social updates. As midnight crept closer, the Titanic sailed onward, faster than ever, her lights glowing against the frozen dark. Passengers slipped into bed, crew kept their posts, and the ship pressed forward across the still, silent ocean. It was a night of calm before the storm, a night so beautiful it disguised the danger waiting in the dark. At 11:40 p.m., on April 14, 1912, the lookouts in Titanic's crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, strained their eyes against the dark horizon. The sea was like glass, the stars glittered bright, but the moon was missing. Suddenly, a dark shadow loomed directly ahead. Fleet rang the bell 3 times, the signal for danger. Then he grabbed the phone and shouted, "Iceberg, right ahead." On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch reacted instantly. He ordered the ship turned hard to port, and the engines reversed. Wheels spun, telegraphs clanged, and sailors rushed to obey. But the Titanic was a giant, over 46,000 tons of steel. She couldn't turn on a dime. Every second counted, and the iceberg was closing fast. The ship began to swing, slowly, agonizingly to the left. Passengers in their cabins felt a strange shudder. Some thought it was nothing more than a change in speed. Others sat up in bed, uneasy. But outside, the iceberg drew nearer, its jagged white sides glowing faintly in the starlight. Then came the sound, a long, low scrape as steel met ice. The iceberg brushed along the starboard side, tearing open the hull like a can opener. Passengers felt the vibration in their beds, a grinding shiver that rattled glassware and woke the uneasy. For some it felt like nothing, for others it was the sound of fate. Chunks of ice tumbled onto the forward deck. Curious passengers stepped outside in their nightclothes, laughing and picking up pieces as souvenirs. They had no idea that beneath their feet seawater was already rushing into the ship's first 5 compartments. To them it was nothing more than a strange midnight thrill. Gronder below, the scene was far less amusing. Water gushed into the mailroom, flooding sacks of letters bound for America. In the boiler rooms, stokers leapt back as icy seawater poured in, rising fast around the furnaces. Men scrambled to close watertight doors as alarms rang out. The Titanic was wounded, and her wounds were fatal. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith arrived, his face grim as Murdoch explained what had happened. Designer Thomas Andrews soon followed, his mind already racing with calculations. The verdict came quickly. 5 compartments were flooded. Titanic could float with 4, but 5? The ship was doomed. Ranzo. Passengers above still had no clue of the seriousness. Many joked about the jolt. Some returned to bed, while others gathered in lounges for midnight drinks. Stewards reassured them it was nothing to worry about. The illusion of safety clung to the ship, even as icy water crept higher below deck. Outside, the iceberg drifted silently away, glowing white in the starlight. Titanic pressed on slowly through the water, but her fate had already been sealed. The Atlantic had dealt its blow, and now time itself was against her. The unsinkable ship had met her match. At that moment no one could fully grasp what had happened. The passengers laughed, the crew scrambled, the officers whispered in hushed tones, but the truth was already written. Titanic was sinking. Not fast, not yet, but unstoppable. The night of beauty had become the night of disaster. For a few minutes after the impact, Titanic's decks were calm. Passengers who had felt the shudder whispered among themselves, wondering if the ship had struck something. Some thought it was just a minor bump. But down below, the truth was already rushing in with icy seawater. In the mailroom, clerks scrambled to save thousands of letters and packages, but the Atlantic poured in too fast. In the boiler rooms, stokers waded through freezing water, desperately trying to keep the fires alive. The ship wasn't sinking gently, it was being swallowed compartment by compartment. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith called in Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer. Andrews examined the damage reports quickly, his face grim. 5 compartments were flooding. He knew the math instantly. Titanic could float with 4, but 5 meant death. Andrews quietly told Smith, "It is a mathematical certainty, she will go down." The captain stood in silence for a long moment, staring out at the black ocean. The proudest ship in the world had less than 3 hours to live. He gave his first orders: wake the passengers, ready the lifeboats, and prepare to send distress calls. The calm Sunday night had just shattered. Meanwhile, passengers remained largely unconcerned. Some joked about the little accident. Others tossed chunks of ice around the deck like snowballs. Stewards reassured them it was nothing serious. The illusion of safety lingered after all. Wasn't Titanic supposed to be unsinkable? In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began tapping out distress signals. QQD, the call for help, was sent into the night. Soon after, Phillips added a new code, one barely used at the time, SOS. Ships across the Atlantic heard Titanic's cry for help, but the nearest was hours away. The mailroom was lost, boiler rooms flooded, and stairwells filled like wells. Sailors worked frantically to close watertight doors, but it was too late. The Atlantic had already taken control, and no human hands could stop it. As word spread quietly among the officers, disbelief filled the air. Titanic was the largest, safest ship ever built. She couldn't sink, not really. But the numbers didn't lie. The truth was too big to hide. The ship that couldn't sink was sinking. Thomas Andrews moved through the ship, politely but firmly urging passengers to dress warmly and put on life jackets. He knew there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. He also knew panic would spread if the truth came out too fast. His calm voice masked the storm inside him. Rinlock was ticking, though few aboard realized it. In less than 3 hours, the proud ship would be gone. For now, the passengers still laughed, still drank, still trusted in Titanic's might. But beneath their feet, the Atlantic was already winning. Shortly after midnight, Captain Smith gave the order no sailor ever wants to hear: prepare the lifeboats. Titanic's officers knew there weren't enough. With more than 2,200 people aboard, there were lifeboats for barely half. The rule was clear: women and children first, but saying it was easier than enforcing it. Stewards moved through the corridors, knocking on doors, urging passengers to dress warmly and put on life jackets. Many were confused. Some laughed it off, refusing to believe the ship could really be in danger. Why go out into the freezing night, they thought, when the Titanic feels so safe and warm? On deck, the first lifeboats were lowered with only a handful of passengers inside. Some women refused to leave their husbands. Others didn't want to climb into a small wooden boat dangling over the freezing Atlantic. Many simply didn't believe the ship was sinking. Precious seats were wasted as half-empty boats touched the water. In first class, the wealthy struggled with disbelief. Men in tuxedos and women in silk gowns gathered on the deck as if attending an unscheduled party. Stewards handed out bulky life jackets that looked ridiculous over evening wear. The elegance of the voyage was melting into fear, though many still tried to mask it with smiles. Families clutched one another, trying not to be separated. Mothers were urged into boats while fathers were left behind on deck. The words "women and children first" cut through the night like a cruel sentence. For third-class passengers, it was even harder. Locked gates and confusing passageways slowed their path to the lifeboats. Many wandered the lower decks, desperately trying to find a way up. Language barriers added to the chaos. Orders barked in English didn't always reach Irish, Italian, and Eastern European ears. As lifeboats splashed into the water, the freezing reality set in. The Atlantic was pitch black, dotted only with the stars above. Passengers who had hesitated now begged for seats, but space was already scarce. Fear rippled through the decks like a cold wind. Some men accepted their fate with quiet dignity. Benjamin Guggenheim, a wealthy industrialist, changed into his finest clothes and declared he would go down like a gentleman. Others tried to sneak into lifeboats disguised as women, only to be caught by officers. The night revealed both the best and worst in human nature. The band kept playing, soft waltzes drifting over the deck, trying to keep passengers calm. The music masked the fear, but only for a while. As more boats pulled away, the Titanic began to tilt, and the truth could no longer be ignored. The unsinkable ship was sinking. By 1:30 a.m., the lifeboats were filling faster. The shouts of officers grew sharper, the cries of children louder. Women and children were pulled from their husbands' arms, lowered into the dark sea below. The policy was clear, but the pain was unbearable. Titanic's decks echoed with both courage and heartbreak. As chaos spread across the decks, one group of men chose a different path. The Titanic's 8 musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, gathered their instruments. Instead of seeking lifeboats, they began to play. The idea was simple. Music could keep people calm. In a night of fear, they offered notes of comfort. At first, the music was lively. Ragtime tunes, cheerful waltzes, songs people knew from hotels and theaters. Passengers smiled nervously, some even clapped along. The melodies distracted them from the lifeboats lowering into the Black Sea. For a few minutes, the Titanic felt less like a sinking ship and more like a ballroom at sea. Families in steerage paused their frantic search for escape routes, listening to the faint sound drifting down the corridors. On the upper decks, the wealthy whispered to one another, clinging to the illusion that everything was under control. Music became a kind of spell, holding panic at bay. Wallace Hartley chose the songs carefully. He knew the power of music, how it could steady a trembling hand or calm a frightened child. The band played on, their fingers stiffening in the cold, bows scraping across frozen strings. Every note was an act of defiance against the fear creeping closer. As the night grew darker, the mood of the music shifted. The lively tunes gave way to hymns and slower melodies. Passengers who once laughed now listened in silence, tears in their eyes. The band was no longer just entertainment. They were comfort, a reminder of dignity in the face of disaster. Some survivors later remembered the musicians smiling as they played, as if determined to hide their own fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder, bows moving in unison, as the deck tilted beneath their feet. Every note carried across the freezing Atlantic, into the ears of those boarding lifeboats. Reports differ on the last song they played. Some swore it was Nearer My God to Thee, others insisted it was Autumn. Either way, the music floated into the night, a final prayer disguised as melody. In the silence of the ocean, it was hauntingly beautiful. Run Crow. By now the decks were chaotic, officers shouting, lifeboats splashing into the sea, people crying out in panic. Yet the band played on, their music cut through the noise, reminding everyone, if only for a moment, that courage still existed even here, even now. One by one, lifeboats rowed away, carrying passengers into the freezing dark. Survivors later said the music followed them across the water, growing fainter with each stroke of the oars. They looked back at Titanic, glowing in the night, and heard the band's final notes drifting across the waves. The musicians never tried to save themselves. They played until the end, their instruments raised against the silence of death. History would remember them not just as performers but as heroes. In the darkest night of the Atlantic, they gave the world one last song. By 2:00 a.m., the Titanic was leaning noticeably to one side. Passengers who had once laughed nervously were now silent, staring at the tilted decks. Water rushed into lower levels, flooding stairwells and corridors. The proud ship that had felt so invincible was dying by the minute. Lifeboats continued to leave, though fewer and fewer spots remained. The cries of children echoed as families were torn apart, with mothers lowered into boats and fathers left behind. The cruel arithmetic of survival was clear. There were simply not enough places for everyone. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, moved quietly through the lounges and corridors, urging people to put on life jackets. Later survivors swore they saw him standing alone by the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, his life jacket discarded. He had done all he could. Captain Edward Smith walked the decks, giving calm orders. Some say he returned to the bridge, choosing to go down with his ship. Others record seeing him urging men into the water, telling them to be British. However, he met his end. He never left Titanic behind. Inside the cabins, some passengers refused to leave. Wealthy couples chose to stay together in bed rather than be separated. Others prayed quietly, clutching rosaries or holding hands. The ship had become a collection of final choices, each made under the shadow of death. At 2:10 a.m., the last collapsible lifeboats were launched. Now only a few hundred spaces remained, while more than 1,000 people still stood on deck. The realization hit hard. Most would not survive. Shouts turned into cries, and cries turned into panic. The band played their final hymn, fading into silence as the bow sank deeper. Survivors later said the music ended with Nearer My God to Thee. Whether true or not, the idea of it became legend, an anthem of dignity as the world's greatest ship slipped away. By now the bow was deep underwater, and the stern began to rise. Passengers clung to railings, staircases, anything solid. Some prayed, some screamed, some leapt into the freezing ocean, rather than be pulled under. The end was coming fast. Runtovich the funnels began to break loose, crashing down with a roar that split the night. Those in the water were crushed instantly. Survivors in lifeboats watched in horror as Titanic's massive body groaned, splitting under the strain. The unsinkable ship was breaking apart. And 20:20 a.m., Titanic's lights flickered once, twice, then went out forever. The ship groaned as her stern rose high, then split in two. With a final plunge, the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, taking over 1,500 souls with her. Silence followed, broken only by cries from the icy water. As Titanic's bow sank lower, the lifeboats scattered across the black Atlantic. Each carried a fragment of the ship's story. Frightened children, grieving mothers, officers rowing hard, and the sound of cries drifting from the darkness behind them. Those lucky enough to be inside knew survival had come at a terrible cost. Some boats were nearly empty. Fear of overcrowding led officers to lower them half full. Lifeboat 1 carried only 12 people, despite having room for 40. Survivors sat in stunned silence, shivering as they watched hundreds still trapped on the Titanic's decks. Lifeboat 6 carried the outspoken Molly Brown, who urged the crew to row back for more survivors. Most resisted, terrified of being swamped by desperate swimmers. Her defiance would earn her the nickname, the unsinkable Molly Brown. a woman who refused to sit quietly while others perished. Out on the open water, the screams began. Hundreds of voices filled the night. Men, women, and children thrashing in water barely above freezing. Survivors in lifeboats wept as they listened, powerless to help. The sound was described as a dreadful chorus that no one ever forgot. Some lifeboats drifted aimlessly, too stunned to row. Others argued over whether to return. The night was filled with human voices. Orders shouted by officers, sobs of children, prayers whispered into the cold air. It was chaos, but chaos in slow motion, surrounded by endless silence of the sea. Collapsible lifeboats, hastily launched, sat dangerously low in the water. Survivors bailed with hats and hands, terrified the boats might sink. Every creak of wood sounded like doom, but even in their fear, they were among the lucky few to escape. From the lifeboats, survivors watched Titanic's final moments. Her stern rose high against the stars before breaking apart. Gasps of disbelief spread through the boats as the unthinkable happened. The unsinkable ship was gone. All that remained were scattered cries and the Black Sea. In the freezing water, hundreds clung to wreckage, praying for rescue. Some called out to loved ones, others went silent as the cold took them. The ocean became a graveyard, silent except for the splash of oars from distant boats. Those in the boats huddled close, sharing blankets, coats, anything to keep warm. Mothers cradled children, men rowed mechanically, and all eyes turned to the horizon, praying for another ship to appear. The night was long, and every minute felt like forever. As the cries in the water faded, a terrible silence fell. Survivors realized what it meant. The others were gone. Titanic had taken more than 1,500 souls with her. The lifeboats drifted in the black Atlantic, waiting, hoping, shivering in the cold. The ship was gone, but the night was not yet over. As Titanic slipped beneath the waves, the lifeboats drifted in the freezing Atlantic. Survivors clung to one another, shivering in silence. Then, faint on the horizon, a speck of light appeared. It was the RMS Carpathia, racing through the night at full speed. Hope had arrived. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia had responded instantly to Titanic's distress call. He ordered his crew to full steam ahead, doubling the number of lookouts for ice. He turned off heating and hot water in the ship, so every ounce of power could be pushed into the engines. Against the odds, Carpathia charged through dangerous ice fields to reach the survivors. By 4 a.m., Carpathia reached the lifeboats. The sight was heartbreaking. Tiny craft bobbing in the vast Atlantic, filled with pale, exhausted survivors. Some wept with relief. Others were too numb to speak. For them, rescue had felt impossible. Yet here was salvation on the horizon. One by one, survivors were hauled aboard. Frozen hands gripped ropes. Children were lifted over rails. Women collapsed into blankets as they reached safety. Sailors worked tirelessly, pulling people up from the sea's edge, each one carrying a story of loss and survival. On deck, the Carpathia's crew gave out blankets, hot coffee and brandy. Doctors treated frostbite, stewards wrapped shivering children, and passengers gave up cabins for the rescued. For many survivors, the warmth of that ship felt like stepping back into life itself. Not every lifeboat was found at once. Carpathia's crew spent hours scouring the icy waters, calling out into the mist, searching for survivors. Each new boat brought both relief and sorrow. Relief for those rescued, sorrow for the empty spaces that meant others were gone. Survivors wept as they realized who was missing. Husbands, fathers, sons left behind on Titanic's decks. Some called out names in vain, others stared silently at the sea. Rescue was salvation, but it was also heartbreak. By morning, all known lifeboats had been collected. In total, 705 people had survived. More than 1,500 had not. The Carpathia's decks were crowded with the saved, but the silence of absence weighed heavily. The Atlantic had taken too many. Cropped, Captain Rostron offered quiet prayers as he turned his ship toward New York. Behind them, the ocean was empty again. No lights, no ship, just drifting ice and the memory of disaster. Carpathia became a ship of grief, carrying the living and the ghost of Titanic. For those aboard Carpathia, survival came with mixed emotions: gratitude for life, sorrow for loss, disbelief at the nightmare they had escaped. As the ship steamed west, they knew nothing would ever feel the same again. They had lived through the impossible. When news of the disaster reached shore, the world could hardly believe it. Titanic, the largest and safest ship ever built, had sunk on her very first voyage. Newspapers rushed to print headlines, telegraph wires buzzed non-stop, and rumors flew faster than facts. In New York, crowds gathered outside newspaper offices, staring at the bulletin boards where updates were posted. People waited for lists of survivors, straining to see if their loved ones were safe. Hope rose and fell with each new scrap of information. Lara de Miley's in Southampton, home to many of Titanic's crew, gathered at the docks and shipping offices, desperate for word. Mothers clutched children, wives wept openly, and silence fell whenever bad news arrived. For the working-class families who had sent their men to sea, the loss was devastating. Wealthy families mourned the loss of millionaires like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, while working-class families mourned nameless stokers and stewards. The tragedy cut across every class. When Carpathia finally arrived in New York on April 18th, thousands crowded the docks. Survivors stumbled ashore, some carried by stretchers, others clutching blankets and staring blankly. The city's roar quieted into a hush as the human cost became clear. Reporters rushed forward, scribbling notes and snapping photographs. Survivors gave dazed interviews, describing icebergs, lifeboats, and the cries from the water. Each story shocked the public further, painting a picture more terrible than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, rumors swirled. At first, some papers reported that Titanic was still afloat and being towed to port. Others claimed all passengers were safe. The truth, when it settled, was far worse than the wildest guesses. Churches held vigils, candles flickered in windows, and the world bowed its head in mourning. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a symbol of modern pride. Its loss shook people's faith in progress itself. If Titanic could sink, what else was vulnerable? White Star Line faced angry questions. Why weren't there enough lifeboats? Why was the ship going so fast? Why had warnings been ignored? For many, grief turned into outrage, demanding answers from the company that had promised safety. From the richest banker in New York to the poorest family in Ireland, the Titanic touched every life. The world mourned together, united by loss. It wasn't just a ship that had gone down. It was an age of confidence sunk in a single night. After the shock came the questions. How could Titanic, the unsinkable ship, sink so quickly on her very first voyage? Governments wasted no time. Both the United States and Britain launched official inquiries. The goal was simple: find someone to blame. In America, Senator William Alden Smith led the inquiry. Survivors fresh from the Carpathia were summoned almost immediately, some still in shock. They testified about the collision, the lack of lifeboats, and the chaos on deck. Their stories horrified the public all over again. In Britain, the inquiry was led by Lord Mersey. It was more formal, with shipbuilders, officers, and crew called to testify. Witnesses described the iceberg warnings, the lifeboat drills that never happened, and the speed Titanic kept despite danger. Piece by piece, the story became clearer. One of the biggest revelations was the lifeboat shortage. Titanic carried just 20 boats, enough for about half the people on board. Legally, this was acceptable at the time, but morally, it was unthinkable. Both inquiries agreed safety regulations were outdated and dangerous. Attention also turned to Captain Smith. Why had he kept Titanic at full speed despite multiple iceberg warnings? Some defended him, saying all liners did the same. Others condemned the decision as reckless. The dead captain could not answer for himself, but his choices were debated fiercely. Bruce Ismay, director of White Star Line, became a lightning rod. He survived the disaster, boarding a lifeboat while over 1,000 died. Newspapers branded him a coward. At the inquiry, he insisted he had helped load women and children before finally stepping in himself. His reputation, however, never recovered. Blame also fell on the nearby ship Californian. She had stopped for the night in ice fields, not far from Titanic. Her crew later admitted seeing rockets in the distance, but failed to act. If she had steamed toward Titanic, hundreds might have been saved. Instead, she remained frozen in the dark. The inquiries concluded that Titanic's loss was not just one man's fault. It was a chain of errors: overconfidence in technology, outdated safety rules, ignored warnings, and human hesitation. The ship had been called unsinkable, and that pride had blinded too many. In the end, both Britain and America agreed on reforms. Ships must carry enough lifeboats for everyone. Lifeboat drills must be mandatory. Wireless operators must stay on duty around the clock. Out of tragedy, safety at sea would never be the same again. The inquiries gave answers, but not comfort. Families still mourned, reputations were shattered, and trust in modern progress was shaken. Titanic had become more than a shipwreck. It was a warning, carved forever into the history of the sea. After Titanic sank, she disappeared into the Black Atlantic, more than 2 miles below the surface. For decades, no one knew exactly where she rested. Survivors described the spot, but the ocean is vast, and Titanic's grave was hidden in silence and darkness. In the years that followed, explorers dreamed of finding her. Books and newspapers called her the wreck of the century. But with the technology of the early 20th century, searching the ocean floor at such depths was impossible. Titanic was lost, a legend swallowed by the sea. Ron Trask and unwind and booked the window pieces. Treasure hunters dreamed of gold and jewels, while families simply wanted closure. The ship's resting place became a mystery that haunted generations. By the 1960s and 70s, advances in sonar and submersibles gave hope. Teams launched expeditions, scanning the Atlantic floor for signs of the giant. Millions of dollars were spent, but the ocean kept its secret. Titanic remained hidden in her cold, dark tomb. Finally, in 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard and a Franco-American team made history. Using deep-sea cameras and sonar, they found Titanic's remains scattered across the seabed. After 73 years, the wreck was no longer a rumor, it was real. Her grand staircase was gone, her stern broken into twisted ruins. Plates, shoes and bottles lay scattered across the seabed. Everyday objects turned into relics of tragedy. Rusticles, stalactite-like formations created by bacteria, covered the hull like a slow disease, eating the iron away. Titanic was still magnificent, but she was also vanishing, piece by piece. Time was claiming her as surely as the ocean had on that April night. The discovery sparked global fascination. TV specials, documentaries and books brought Titanic's ghostly remains into people's living rooms. For the first time, the world could see the reality of her fate, not just in stories but in haunting photographs from the deep. Debate quickly followed. Some argued Titanic's grave should be left untouched, a memorial at sea. Others saw opportunity in salvage, bringing artifacts to the surface for museums or for profit. Even in death, the Titanic sparked arguments about ownership, memory, and respect. No matter the debates, one truth remained: Titanic's wreck had become the most famous in history. Her story, frozen in rust and silence, drew millions of hearts back to the night she sank. More than a ship, she was a time capsule of an age, lying forever in the cold Atlantic. Even after she sank, the Titanic never truly left us. Her story echoed across generations, retold in books, films, songs, and museums. More than a shipwreck, she became a symbol of human ambition, human error, and human courage. In the years after the disaster, memorials rose in cities across the world. Southampton, Liverpool, New York, Belfast all built statues and plaques to honor the dead. The names of crew, passengers, and even the musicians were carved into stone, reminders that the story belonged to everyone. Museums began to collect artifacts, china plates with the White Star emblem, pocket watches stopped at the moment the ship sank, letters written on Titanic stationery. Each object was a whisper from 1912, carrying the weight of lives interrupted. Titanic also lived on in music and literature. Poets wrote verses of loss, songwriters composed ballads, and newspapers serialized survivor accounts. The tragedy was not just recorded in history books, it was woven into culture, becoming part of the collective imagination. Hollywood took notice too. The Titanic appeared on screen as early as 1912, just weeks after the sinking. Over the years, countless films retold her story, culminating in James Cameron's 1997 epic, which brought the tragedy to millions more and cemented her legend for new generations. Survivors themselves carried the memory longest. Some gave interviews, others avoided the subject for life. They were forever bound to that night of ice and fire, their stories living bridges between past and present. Titanic became a lesson taught in schools, a parable of hubris and humility. The phrase unsinkable ship became a warning about arrogance, and lifeboat laws changed forever. In memory, Titanic was no longer just a ship, it was a teacher. In Belfast, where she was built, Titanic became both pride and sorrow. For decades, her name was whispered quietly, as if cursed. But in time, the city embraced its legacy, building the Titanic Belfast Museum to honor the workers who gave her life. Today, Titanic's name is known everywhere, from history books to pop culture references. She sails on not through the sea but through memory, imagination, and the enduring fascination of people drawn to her story. In the end, Titanic is more than iron and rivets. She is the story of hope, pride, tragedy, and survival. She is a reminder that no matter how strong we think we are, nature always has the final word. And yet, in memory she never sinks, she sails on, forever.